How's it going, everybody? Greg here with Gregarious Media, and welcome to an album review of the new Voices in Vain debut, Narcotics and Animal Instincts. Voices in Vain are a Vermont-based metal band who have influences ranging across the spectrum. Their sound, or the core of it, is around more metallic hardcore, such as Code Orange, Converge, and Norma Jean. But they also have influences from Rage Against the Machine, System of a Down, and even a little bit of Pink Floyd. So, safe to say, they're pretty much down for anything and are willing to push their boundaries. They released a self-titled EP back in 2015. It was definitely a good start, but it wasn't quite the sound that Voices wanted to continue with. They also released a single in 2016 called Sex Sells. I was in that video. A very proud moment in my life. But it was also a little more straightforward than where Voices in Vain really wanted to go. They really wanted to experiment more in their sound. Sort of like along the lines of a Code Orange, where there's obvious metalcore and hardcore sounds there, but we're able to branch off into different industrial and alternative influences. So after a year and a half of recording this album, it's finally out. This was recorded in Silver Bullet Studios and produced by Greg Thomas, who is a metal veteran who has been busy. If you look at the discography on the website, it's insane what this guy's been involved in. Here's a track by track of Voices in Vain's Narcotics and Animal Instincts. Let's go! The album opens up with Victim of the Void, which is the third single released in promotion of this album, which was also released the day before the album's release. And the music video for this is very top-notch. I highly recommend you check that out. Victim of the Void opens up this album with a very pop-punk mixed with a bit of a heavy metal sort of vibe. It's definitely not heavy, but it's still hard. To open this album up, it does kind of throw you off a little bit, because you're expecting something that's really like dissonant and just beating your face in. Give the song about 40 seconds and it slowly builds into an extremely heavy riff that just bashes you within the second that it comes in, after Jeremy screams that the world is not his home. Lyrically, Jeremy portrays this character of having thoughts of death, suicidal depression, and being trapped in this void feeling that, despite the fact that there are moments where he feels free and can escape this void, that he ends up falling back in, that this is a repeating cycle. He's a victim of this void that he cannot come out of. This is definitely a great opening track, but a little bit misleading for the first 40 seconds, because it's not exactly heavy up until Jeremy just straps you in for this very depressing and yet very entertainingly heavy ride. Antichrist was the first teaser track that was actually released about over a year ago. There is different mixing on this as opposed to the single mix from released back then. This is the shortest song on the album, being only 2 minutes and 16 seconds. But goddamn does it go hard. From Victim of the Void, it ends on this very melodic guitar but dissonance, distortion building note. And then Antichrist just slams you with riffs and rhythms galore. It's definitely one of the thrashiest songs and definitely the more hardcore focused song on the project. And lyrically, it talks about this character, or these characters, basically being very influenced by greed. These characters that focus on profits over humanity, basically using their influence to take control over this very politically and socially divided landscape in this time where everyone is pretty much out for blood and out for everyone's throats. It's a great thrashy nugget. By Any Means Necessary was the second single released off this album, and this also was released about a year ago. It was released with a different mix back then as well with Antichrist. This definitely has much more of a groove-focused sound to it. There's definitely still obvious elements of hardcore, but it's not nearly as thrashy as Antichrist is. This definitely focuses much more on the more groove-oriented rhythms, and the guitar, the bass, the drums very much are in sync with this very catchy riff that is just very funky, very heavy. It has kind of a reminiscent of Rage Against the Machine a little bit, with a little bit of like a Every Time I Die sort of vibe. Because the riffs and rhythms, they're pretty much only a few, because they're structured very intently with verse and choruses in mind, even though there aren't really verse chorus moments throughout this album. This is the one song that probably is as close to a verse chorus structure as you're going to find. Lyrically, By Any Means Necessary advocates for gathering evidence against corruption and abuse of power. This was, I know, was influenced around the time that police brutality was really gaining traction in mainstream media, listing off these events in which influences this mindset where peaceful protests are met with force, fearing the powers while unarmed or killed, and that violence is a last resort, but if it comes down to it, it will be done with no remorse. This is showing, whether it's Jeremy himself or the character that he's portraying, who is clearly calling for change, but is sick and tired of having to wait and just see more innocent people get hurt due to the corrupted powers that be. Young Again shows a bit of a slower and darker tone, where at the beginning it starts off very energetic as Jeremy is screaming that she cried as he fell off the edge, and then suddenly the music stops for about 2 or 3 seconds, and then the guitar comes in very dissonant, very slow, and the drums are very laid back. There's a very constant ride cymbal, but the drums are used very sparsely. So it definitely builds up this more creepy atmosphere, but not in the way that it's like making your blood boil and ready to hit something. It's more creepy in the sense that it makes your blood chill. The chorus of this song easily has one of my favorite riffs on the entire album. It is anthemic as fuck, and I love it. The second verse does pick up a bit of intensity, and it sort of jumps between this more thrashier, intense mental breakdown and back to a little bit of the dissonance and slower, darker tones that we heard at the beginning of the song, but it jumps back and forth, showing this character who is addicted on drugs and alcohol, that he's sort of having this breakdown and he's fighting it. It sort of takes on that this man is basically at death's door and he's willing to die to attempt to find his youth again, or at least that's how I'm interpreting it. And when the song does shift sonically in the final third, it goes into a much brighter sound and lyrically talks about the sun is beating down on this character who has hands so small and pale, and that the anxieties of the old world were stolen away with the scent of decay. My interpretation of the end of this is this character, either he died so that his youth could be reborn in this afterlife sort of picture, or that his youth is dying with him in this decaying world that sort of is portrayed. The Raven and the Snake is definitely one of the more groove metal influence tracks. All the grooves and riffs are super infectious with how funky they are. Creepy dissonance that keeps building throughout every transition of each riff is also a very nice touch. The crunching riffs to emphasize certain moments is also really nice. And the breakdown toward the end is one of those that it's slow, and then it starts having this little chaotic guitar noodling and crunching, and then it goes back into the slower part, but even slower, and somehow the dissonance is even louder and even slightly more melodic than previously. It's definitely one of the more interesting breakdowns on this project. Lyrically, it talks about betrayal, how the character that Jeremy is portraying becomes the Raven that hunts down these snakes in which had betrayed him previously, but then also is just going after the snakes of the world. Narcotics is an instrumental track, and it's definitely the most mellow of the tracks, and maybe it's because Jeremy's not screaming all over it. It opens up with a very mellow guitar riff that tends to pop up on multiple occasions throughout the song. It's definitely the riff that it comes back to, but every time that it's repeated, the build-up that happens afterward is always different, whether it's a little more rhythmic, whether it's a little bit more heavier, and especially toward the end where it just builds and builds and builds on the drums. I don't have a lot to say about this song because there's no lyrics that I can describe here, but it's definitely a really nice sort of break from the intensity. Which then leads into Animal Instincts, which is easily the most chaotic of the bunch. It hits straight out the gate with Jeremy screaming in your face. The guitars are noodling incredibly dissonant notes, and it's talking about this man who has basically given up on society, given up on intellect and thought, and just basically going primal and just bloodthirsty. The instrumentation contrasts between a couple of mellow points, but the mellow points, I should put in quotations, are still very dark sounding, and the song just hops intensity so much because it's perfectly encompassing what this character is going through with this mental breakdown, this primal bloodlust that keeps popping up throughout the entire song, and this refrain of feast on rotten flesh continues to keep popping up throughout. So this is sort of describing him basically going deeper and deeper down this primal demonic hole in his head. The Charlatan's Faith is probably one of my favorite tracks on here because it's very dense considering it's only about 2 minutes and 40 seconds. There are moments of just hardcore, moments of kind of something like power metal, something along the lines of sludge metal, and then you have just, fuck it, Rage Against the Machine, why not? And it's all amazing the way each one transitions into one another. And lyrically, The Charlatan's Faith is one of those on religious hypocrisy, in which I am all for that. There's not much I have to explain here. The final track, which I was not expecting at all, mind you, every song on here except for Victim of the Void, I've actually heard first drafts of. Voices in Vain and I went to college together, so I knew a lot of these songs in their first drafts, and I love where the songs have become since their initial drafts. This song, the closing one, I never heard before, up until this point. And it is a juggernaut 8.5 minute closing track. I was not expecting that when I opened my inbox and I looked at how long each song was. Because Voices in Vain's live sets never have these long songs. So this was quite the treat. It's easily the longest, most dense song, and oh my god, it is amazing. There are so many rhythms and riffs going from like sort of a modern heavy metal take to a little bit of deathcore to some hardcore and, you know, kind of traditional metalcore stuff, but it all transitions together so well. I still don't understand how they can throw so many different sounds into one song, and this is 8.5 minutes, so they have to keep it interesting. And never once throughout the song is there a dull moment at all. And the dynamics on the song with how each riff builds into one another, and then toward the end where it ends up just being clean guitar and very light drums, it is just sounds so beautiful of an ending considering how brutally heavy the 6 minutes before this part was. Lyrically, the song is analyzing humanity's faults and pretty much shaming humanity for giving into sort of these greedy tendencies that have sort of been a trend in sort of our history, and how we've sort of taken nature for granted and that nature is going to strike back. And toward the end of the song, the verdict comes in that humanity is guilty, in which then the heaviness just stops, and then the very nice, beautiful guitar and very light drums come in, And that's where I'm assuming sort of the apocalypse happened, humanity died, and then everything is just suddenly peachy keen. This song is definitely not what I was expecting. And to be perfectly honest on that note, I did not know what to expect from this album. Outside of Antichrist and By Any Means Necessary, those two tracks were out for over a year. I did not know what to expect from this album. And I've been to virtually any Voices in Vain show that they had while we were in college together. And my God, I am blown away by how amazing this sounds. Having Greg Thomas behind the boards mixing was definitely a smart investment. So Greg Thomas, if you're watching this, fucking solid, bub. This is definitely a musical direction that I'm very glad that Voices in Vain went in. They're very huge fans of Code Orange, Between the Buried and Me, Every Time I Die. They love hardcore, they love metalcore, they love progressive and experimental metal, and they were able to fuse all their influences together so well that if there was one thing that maybe I would complain about is just maybe having a little bit more thrashier stuff, because Antichrist is... it deserves so much more than just 2 minutes and 15 seconds, but you know what? It's such a fucking great track, and the entire album is fucking great too. Jesus. Basically sounds like I'm kissing ass. And I want anyone to know, yeah, I went to college with them, and if I thought the album was gonna suck, I would tell them it sucked. But honestly, this is amazing. I was not expecting it to be this amazing. I expected it to be, at the very least, good. And this is easily one of my favorite albums of the year so far, and definitely my favorite metal release so far this year. Voices in Vain, Narcotics and Animal Instincts, rating.